Welcome back to my channel for the second in a series of videos about life purpose in relation to human design and also in relation to kind of our cultural development and our collective development. I'm going to start by talking a bit about the design crystal, which comes out of what Ra, who is the founder of human design, called the rave cosmology. So I'm going to share a little bit from him about that and talk a little bit about the design crystal. And then give some context about why this is important and how I think it is influencing you and all of us in terms of our pursuit of life purpose and the contribution that we want to be making in the world. I want to share a quotation from Ra that I got from an article that's in a blog over on the Jovian Archive website if you want to go check it out. So he says, the neutrino ocean produced by all the living stars is filtered by the crystals of consciousness. I just love that. Isn't that beautiful? Every living thing is endowed with two crystals of consciousness, an aspect of the original yin, which in human design is the design crystal that transforms the neutrino data into the body and the life, and the original yang, the personality crystal that transforms the neutrino data into the potential of self-reflected consciousness. What binds the bioverse together, meaning the yin and the yang, binds us as well. It's the third and crucial element in the structure of a nine-centered being, the magnetic monopole. Now, according to the story of human design, the fetus at conception is endowed with this design crystal. And this design crystal is what helps manifest the evolving form of the body and the life. Whereas the personality crystal comes in at about 3 months before 88 days prior the birth, and it actually floats up here on the top of the head, whereas the design crystal goes into the skull. And that personality crystal is really about who we think we are. And the magnetic monopole, that is what maintains our unique integrity and destiny. And it's interesting, the magnetic monopole is in the G center, which is the center for identity and direction in life. So those things really fit together. I bring up this kind of esoteric aspect of human design that is not talked about very much because I think it's actually quite interesting and it's helpful for us in terms of thinking about life purpose in relation to human design. Now let me unpack that a little bit. So the design crystal is calibrated to the level of consciousness at the planet, like the medium level of consciousness, at the time that it's taken out of the earth and put into the fetus. This is, again, according to the mythology of human design. So what this means is that depending upon when you were conceived, the level of consciousness of your design crystal can be very, very different. So we've had many changes in the last 75, 80 years. Right? I mean, we really have astronomically developed on so many different levels. The most obvious level is technology, but we've also developed on the level of consciousness. I know some of this is a little bit difficult for certainly the Gen Zers. I have a Gen Z at home, and even the millennials to some degree because they were born more recently, and so for them to have more of the longer term view is a little bit more difficult. That's part of the reason I want to share this today, because I think it's helpful. Being a historicist by training, I think it's helpful for us to have a longer context and a longer historical view to understand kind of what we're dealing with here. In doing research for this, I discovered that The Man's Search for Meaning, which is Viktor Frankl's book that he wrote after being in a concentration camp, where he really talks about how the sense that he had meaning when he was in the concentration camp, what we kind of blandly call positive thinking, but really it's about being able to have a kind of sense of purpose and of why I'm here and how I can have more command over my emotions, command over my thought process, or command over my very being, right? And that is what helped him get through his time in the concentration camp. And he has a whole therapy that is based on that. And that came out in 1946, right after World War II ended. Well, just a year later than that was Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which came out in 1947. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, in contrast, really looked at what motivates people. It helps us to understand life purpose from the sense of looking at what are we challenged by and what have we got handled. If you take a look at this model here, you'll see that down at the very bottom are really our survival needs, right? The things that we have to have in order to be able to just be able to exist. And when we don't have those handled, then our purpose in a lot of ways is just to get those elements, right? We have to have food, we have to have water, we have to have shelter. Right. He also includes sex in here, which is procreation and some form of self-expression, and also homeostasis, which is the ability to stay warm enough when it's cold and cool enough when it's hot. Right. These are very primal, basic things that we all need. And if we don't have them handled, then our purpose is going to be all wrapped up in making sure that they do get handled. And you can see as he goes up and through the different levels here that we're able to move away from just trying to make sure that we have enough to eat and that we have enough shelter to be able to get through the night and to make sure that our kids are okay, to be able to be looking at what he considers higher and higher aspects of our being, all the way up to self-actualization. And self-actualization is what I think a lot of us consider life purpose in today. And I wanted to point this out because for some people still here on the planet, they're still working down at the bottom part of this hierarchy, right? They're still trying to make sure that they have enough to heat and enough water and enough to take care of their kids. So I want to just acknowledge that from the get-go. But the interest in life purpose evolved in part because particularly people in the West their standard of living really got raised after World War II. And so we started to be able to ask more existential questions, if you will. Why are we here? What is our purpose? What is life all about? And some would go in the direction of nihilism, which is like, there is no meaning, there is no purpose, and why are we even here? But then there are other more uplifting inquiries into that. And some of those questions really broke open during the 1960s and 70s. Over the last 75 years or so, we've increasingly become more and more of a global society. We can really completely see that today. The pandemic showed that to us. But back during that really revolutionary period of time, one of the things that happened in the West is that we became really influenced by ways of being and religions and spirituality that were much more commonplace in what we call the East, right? And so Buddhism came in, and ancient yoga traditions came in, and acupuncture, right? And so the whole idea, for example, that we have a body of energy, we're not just a physical or material reality, that we are in fact spiritual beings living in a physical form, having that experience that we are not separate from God, we're not separate from the divine, that in fact we are actually an expression of this kind of life force energy. This was pretty new and radical during that time. I know it might be hard to think of it now, but this was very, very revolutionary. And even something like meditation. We had prayer for sure coming out of Christianity and also out of Islam and also out of Judaism. But this idea of meditation is something that we definitely got from Asia. And it has really influenced us so much now around what we think of as right action or right relationship or integrity even, or the dangers of the mind. Now we have, bumper stickers and slogans that say things like, don't believe what you think. But it was a new idea even that you're not your thoughts, that you could actually observe your thoughts, that you could separate, that there was a part of you that could separate from your thoughts and watch your thoughts. All of that was very new and has been very, very radical. And what is this observing self, right? This is a spiritual self. It's partly our energy. It's a different part of our energetic system. And so as we became introduced like to the chakra system and to the meridians that have been mapped in acupuncture, all of this was really new for us. And the idea that our health and our well-being were influenced if our energy was and how our energy was flowing or not. When I had my house in Oakland, we had an office that was connected to it, and there was a woman who actually used many modalities, but she was an acupuncturist, and she had a little piece of paper on her filing cabinet that kind of looked like something would come out of a fortune cookie. I don't think it was, but it said that circulation equals health, stagnation equals illness, right? And so these were all ideas that have been introduced to us in the last 75 years. Now, the reason I bring this up is depending on when your design crystal came into your form, you may or may not have been influenced by these new changes. So, for example, for me, I was born closer to the beginning of that 75 years. I was born in 1959. And so my design crystal was not influenced by all of these new ideas that came in, 10, 20 years later. Whereas for those of you who are born more in the middle of that 75 years, right? Those of you who are in your late 20s, your 30s, even into your 40s, you will have been influenced in your design crystal by the changes that had happened on the planet, so that this idea of consciousness, raising your frequency, raising your vibration, all of that was something that was much more pervasive and had definitely influenced what was going on in the West. And so for you came in already having some of that imprinted into your design crystal, which then organized the development of your physical form, right? I did not. So one of the things that this means, for example, for me, is that I've had to work harder, I think, in order to be able to receive and apply and integrate and actually live with these ideas of consciousness, with frequency, with vibration, and all of that. It was something that I had to learn when I was more of an adult, and I had to take that on. Where those of you who are of younger generations, you kind of came in ready for that already. You already had an influence or an imprinting of that in your whole design that enables you to access it more easily. So some of the ways that this might show up for you, for example, that is in a driving force inside of you that questions authority and old paradigms, or knows or at least suspects that there's more than just the material or physical reality, that feels that happiness, meaning, and purpose are significant, more than just security or safety, which I think was more of a standard that my generation focused on. You may automatically feel more concerned about climate change or about the environment. You may value equality for all people and have a real disdain for hierarchy, for sexism and racism and homophobia and economic inequality and so on. These are all ideas and attitudes that were seeded and explored earlier on, that those of us who lived through that time have had to, like I said, take in and integrate. And it's part of our growth process. So part of our life purpose has been to work with those ideas and those awakenings and that level of consciousness in a way that those of you who are younger, I think, haven't had the same journey that we have. Let me just emphasize, all of us have access to these values, right? I consider myself someone who has made it an organizing principle. These ideas about questioning authority, about equality for all people, about the concern about our earth, our climate, and our environment, and so on. These are organizing principles for my life. But I know many people my age, and I'm among the youngest boomers, right? I'm almost on the cusp with Gen X. But many people who are boomers and Gen Xers have not. I mean, especially after they stopped being hippies, right? The boomers, right? They became much more interested in security, in safety, in getting a good job, working for their lives, having money for retirement, and so on, because their design crystals were not calibrated to the level of consciousness that started coming in later. And so they would have had to have really made that a purpose for them. I did that, but many people have not. I think this is one of the reasons that people of my generation and even Gen Xers have been willing and able really to ignore some of the big issues that are facing us today, right? This isn't an excuse for that. It's just a kind of observation and a perspective that I think can help us understand why some of this might be so from a human design perspective. I also know that the 80s were a big time of flourishing of all kinds of different spiritual teachings and spiritual systems. I mean, human design was downloaded in 1987, and it came out as a book in the early 90s. But I know two of my major spiritual teachers, Snea Roman and Dwayne Packer, who are channels for the light beings of Orin and Dobbin, began their work in the 1980s and published their first books there. It started the Awakening Your Life Body courses and so on. I received them much later, but they were seeded and started to really be very influential in the 1980s and the 1990s. So one of the things that means is for those of you who were born in the 1980s and the 1990s, and subsequently, already had kind of ready in your design crystal a certain level of consciousness that has made it available for you to start from a new place than people of my generation. So my point is that when we come to the question of life purpose, we come from different starting points. And while that might be obvious in terms of outer circumstances and kind of what was happening historically, it is not so clear from a human design point of view that our design crystals are actually calibrated differently. So whatever your age, you might want to investigate the pervasive attitudes, the assumptions, the expectations, and the level of consciousness, if you will, that was going on when you were conceived, because that is a deeply influential aspect of who you are that is going to influence your relationship to life purpose. I see this as that younger generations are seeking self-actualization earlier in life. They're starting with the desire to raise their frequency, to have a higher vibration, to expand their consciousness, to be living from a higher state earlier in their lives. Whereas older generations didn't really consider this a lot of times until their career trajectory or their marriage went off the rails and forced them to kind of step back and take another look at their lives. This is really common that I see when people come to me for a reading, whereas the younger generations really want to know themselves so that they can feel like they're on purpose, so that they can know what is meaningful for them in their lives, so that they can organize their lives around that. Whereas older generations really come to me because something has really broken in their lives, and maybe it's still broken, or maybe they've recovered and they're looking for what's going to happen for them in their next stage. So it's a really different starting place. And I find it interesting because Ra always said that human design was for the children. Now remember, he said this, back in the 90s. Was for the children, but in order for it to get to the children, it had to go to the adults first. And what I'm seeing is more and more younger people coming to me for readings, and I think that's awesome. I was just listening to an interview the other day of a man who I think he's in his late 20s or early 30s, who said that this happened to him at age 26, that he had, he'd gotten an education, he got a good job, he was set up, he had good finances, but at age 26, okay, he was already feeling hollow inside. Like the path that he saw to becoming an adult and becoming successful was already not satisfying for him by the age of 26. Now, I was 10 years later in my life. I was closer to 36, 37 by the time that happened for me. So here's the thing. Human design really helps us to break free of social conditioning and cultural imperatives that tell us who we can be, what we can do, what our paths in life are. And I think for people who are millennials and Gen Zers are even more this way, is that they are throwing off a lot of those social conditioning at an earlier and earlier age and coming to human design as an ally to help them do that. I'm really excited that I am getting to connect with people who are more in their 30s now, because I think that this is such a huge tool to be using at an early age so that you can get in touch with what's really true for you. You can peel away the veils of what you were told was true. And we're at a time right now where the challenges that we're seeing are forcing us to get more in truth, forcing us to look at the consequences of honestly what previous generations have done. And certainly boomers were a part of this, where we have got a degraded environment, and we've got climate change, and we've got massive economic inequality, and we've still got racism and sexism and homophobia and ableism and xenophobia and all of that. But the good news is that millennials and Gen Z are way more on top of this. Like, they seem to be really ready. I know that my kid blows me away sometimes. My kid is 20. With their attitude that I'm like, well, probably some of it came from growing up with me, but I think a lot of it might have come from when they got their design crystal and also the world that they're growing up in now. So even though, yes, we're all subject to conditioning, I feel really inspired by what I see happening with younger people. I was just doing some other research on millennials and Gen Zers for work that I'm doing. And, Gen Zers have climate change as their number one concern. And millennials have climate change as their number two concern. Right now, it's health and well-being, which I think makes sense. We just have been going through a pandemic, and for a lot of millennials, they have kids, and so it's very stressful, right? The whole thing has been very stressful. But climate change is right up there. I wouldn't be surprised in the next few years if we saw those priorities change again, as we are able to move out of this pandemic into something that feels a little bit more stable in terms of our health and well-being. So for you, I want to leave you with the inquiry to take a look at what are the values and the things that you are important. How do you already think about consciousness and frequency and vibration, and that you have an energy body, and that you're an energy being in an energy universe? And how is that influencing your relationship to what you feel your purpose is, or what your contribution is in the world? And are you already doing things that are helping you to, on a daily basis, regular basis, be able to lift your vibration and to stay at a high frequency? Because when you do that, from a human design point of view, what'll happen is you'll be able to receive the inner guidance that is always available to you through your strategy, through your authority, through all of the intuition that's in the human design chart, which I will go into more in the other videos about life purpose. A similar human design chart with somebody who is born 30 years apart could be very, very different in how we interpret it. This is why when I do a reading for people and I'm helping them with their life purpose, I'm always asking people about their life experience and where they're at, because that's going to really influence what I see in the chart and what I would recommend for what they might explore for themselves and how they might get more in touch with their purpose and their contribution. Okay, that's my investigation for today. Many blessings, much love. Bye for now.